On a frigid February morning in 1979, employees at the Continental Commerce Bank in Chicago's Loop District arrived to discover something impossible. The main vault, protected by what was considered state-of-the-art security, had been compromised. $4.6 million in cash had vanished without a trace. No alarms had been triggered. No doors had been forced. No windows had been shattered. The money had simply disappeared into the winter air, as if it had never existed at all. For 35 years, the case remained one of the FBI's most baffling unsolved bank heists in the Midwest. Investigators pursued thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and watched countless individuals they believed might be connected to the theft. Every trail went cold. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. The money, and whoever took it, had vanished so completely that some investigators began to wonder if they'd ever truly understood what had happened that night. The answer, it turned out, had been hiding beneath the floorboards of a modest bungalow on Chicago's South Side the entire time. In 2014, when a grandson began renovating his late grandfather's basement, he made a discovery that would finally solve one of the city's greatest mysteries. Behind a false wall, sealed in waterproof containers and preserved almost perfectly, sat the missing millions. And the man who had pulled off the impossible heist had lived quietly above it for more than 3 decades, never spending a single dollar, never arousing the slightest suspicion, taking his secret to the grave. His name was Terence Hayes. He had worked as a night custodian at the Continental Commerce Bank, and his patience, discipline, and intimate knowledge of the building's every secret had allowed him to execute what federal investigators would later call one of the most meticulously planned bank robberies in American history. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Continental Commerce Bank occupied the first 3 floors of a 12-story office building on South LaSalle Street, in the heart of Chicago's financial district. In 1979, it was a mid-sized institution that served primarily local businesses and manufacturing companies, many of them family-owned operations that had been part of Chicago's industrial backbone for generations. The bank held millions in cash deposits, particularly on weekends when businesses would drop their weekly receipts into the night deposit vault. Terence Hayes had worked at the building since 1971. He was 42 years old in 1979, a Korean War veteran who had returned from service with an honorable discharge and a preference for solitary work. He was hired as part of the night custodial crew, working the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift, 6 days a week. His supervisor described him as the most reliable employee in the building. He never called in sick. He never complained. He arrived 15 minutes early every night and often stayed late to finish a job properly. Hayes lived alone in a small bungalow in the Chatham neighborhood on the South Side, a working-class area where everyone knew their neighbors and most families had lived for generations. His wife had died in 1969 from complications related to diabetes, leaving him to raise their young daughter, Michelle, on his own. Those who knew him described a devoted father who attended every parent-teacher conference, who walked his daughter to school each morning before going home to sleep, who never missed a birthday or school play despite working nights. But beneath this quiet, dependable exterior, Hayes was drowning. His wife's medical bills had devastated him financially. Despite having insurance, the experimental treatments and medications had cost tens of thousands of dollars. He had taken out a second mortgage on his home. He had borrowed money from family members he could never hope to repay. By 1973, he was working a second job on weekends, doing maintenance work for a local church, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, watching his savings evaporate despite his best efforts. It was during those long, solitary nights at the bank that Hayes began to truly see the building, not as a custodian cleaning floors and emptying trash, but as a man who understood its rhythms, its secrets, its vulnerabilities in ways that no one else possibly could. He noticed patterns first. The bank's security guard, a retired police officer named Donald Cruz, had a precise routine. Every night at 1:15 a.m., Cruz would leave the building through the rear entrance to smoke a cigarette in the alley behind the building. The break lasted exactly 12 minutes. Hayes had timed it dozens of times. The guard was nothing if not consistent, a man of rigid habit who had probably performed the same routine thousands of times without variation. Hayes noticed that the bank's alarm system, installed in 1968, operated on a timer system controlled from a central panel in the basement. Between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., certain zones of the building were automatically deactivated to prevent false alarms from the custodial staff moving through the building. The system had been designed for convenience, to allow cleaning crews to work without constantly triggering sensors. No one had apparently considered that this convenience created a window of vulnerability. He noticed that the main vault, despite its imposing appearance and supposedly sophisticated locks, shared a ventilation system with the mechanical room where the building's furnace and air conditioning units were housed. The vault required climate control to protect important documents and prevent moisture damage. That ventilation system, Hayes realized, was accessible from the basement mechanical room where he spent time each night, a space he had the keys to and which no one else ever visited during his shift. For 2 years, Hayes simply observed and catalogued information. He took no action. He made no plans. He simply learned the building in a way that perhaps no one else ever had, understanding it as a living system with predictable patterns and exploitable weaknesses. He studied the vault's locking mechanism during the day, watching from a distance as bank employees opened and closed it. He researched the manufacturer and learned that this particular model, despite being considered secure in 1968, had a known vulnerability in its time lock mechanism that could be exploited if someone had enough time and the right tools. By 1975, Hayes had begun to formulate a plan, but he moved with extraordinary caution and patience. He spent months acquiring tools, purchasing them slowly from different stores across the Chicago area, never buying more than 1 or 2 items from the same location. He bought bolt cutters from a hardware store in Oak Park. He purchased a small acetylene torch from a welding supply company in Cicero. He acquired lockpicking tools through a mail-order catalog, having them shipped to a post office box he'd rented under a false name in a neighboring suburb. He practiced. In his basement at home, he constructed a replica of the vault's ventilation grate using measurements he'd carefully memorized. He practiced removing and replacing it hundreds of times, timing himself, learning to do it in complete darkness, making the process so automatic that he could perform it without conscious thought. He researched safe-cracking techniques in the public library, reading books on locksmithing and security systems, studying the vulnerabilities of the specific model of time lock the bank used. Hayes understood that the greatest challenge wasn't getting into the vault. The greatest challenge was avoiding detection afterward. He studied other famous bank robberies, learning from both their successes and their failures. He read about the ways thieves had been caught, the mistakes they'd made, the patterns that had led investigators to them. Most criminals, he noticed, failed because of 3 things. They spent the money too quickly, they talked to someone about their crime, or they changed their behavior in noticeable ways after the theft. Hayes resolved that he would do none of these things. Whatever he took, he would never spend. Whoever might suspect him, he would give them no evidence. Whatever life he lived afterward, it would be exactly the same life he'd lived before. The money, he decided, wasn't for him. It was insurance for his daughter, something she might need decades in the future, long after any investigation had gone cold and he himself was gone. By early 1979, Hayes was ready. He had spent nearly 6 years preparing for a crime that would take less than 3 hours to execute. He had mapped every moment, anticipated every complication, prepared for every contingency. He had chosen a specific date, February 16th, 1979, a Friday night going into Saturday morning. The bank's records showed that Friday nights typically had the highest deposits in the vault, as local businesses dropped off their weekly receipts. February was ideal because the cold weather meant fewer people on the streets, less chance of unexpected witnesses, and the heating system in the building would be running at full capacity, masking any sounds he might make. February 16th, 1979, began like any other night for Terence Hayes. He arrived at the Continental Commerce Bank building at 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before his shift began, just as he always did. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and a bitter wind howled down LaSalle Street, driving the few remaining pedestrians indoors. Snow had been forecast for later in the evening. Hayes wore his usual winter coat, carried his usual metal lunch pail, and nodded to the security guard at the front entrance with his usual quiet greeting. Donald Cruz, the security guard, would later tell investigators that Hayes had seemed completely normal that night. Perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but Hayes was always quiet. The custodian had clocked in, collected his cleaning supplies from the maintenance closet, and begun his rounds exactly as he had done thousands of times before. Hayes started on the 12th floor, as was his custom, working his way down through the building. He mopped floors, emptied trash bins, cleaned bathrooms, and locked offices, moving through the familiar routine with mechanical precision. But his mind was racing, reviewing every step of the plan he'd rehearsed so many times in his imagination. He was acutely aware of the time, of the guards' movements below, of the rhythm of the building settling around him. At 1:15 a.m., exactly as Hayes had anticipated, Donald Cruz left through the rear entrance for his cigarette break. Hayes, working on the 3rd floor at that moment, paused and counted silently. 12 minutes. He had 12 minutes of opportunity, repeated at 1:15 a.m. every single night. But tonight, he wouldn't use this window. Tonight was about establishing normalcy, about ensuring that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The actual theft would happen during the alarm system's dead zone, between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., when his presence in normally restricted areas wouldn't trigger sensors. At 2:17 a.m., Hayes descended to the basement. He carried his usual cleaning supplies and his usual lunch pail. But tonight, the lunch pail contained the tools he'd been slowly smuggling into the building over the past 3 weeks, hidden in various maintenance closets and spaces that no one else accessed. He'd brought them in a few pieces at a time, concealed beneath legitimate work tools, spreading the risk across multiple nights until everything he needed was in place. The basement mechanical room was located at the far end of a corridor that ran the length of the building. It was a space filled with the building's heating and cooling infrastructure, a maze of pipes and ducts and machinery that rumbled and hissed throughout the night. Hayes had spent countless hours in this room over the years, performing maintenance, checking systems, familiarizing himself with every inch of it. Tonight, it would serve as his entry point to the vault. The vault itself was located directly above the mechanical room on the bank's main floor. Hayes had spent months studying the building's blueprints, which he'd accessed by befriending a maintenance supervisor at City Hall who had access to the municipal records. The blueprints had confirmed what Hayes had suspected. The vault's ventilation shaft ran down through the floor into the mechanical room, where it connected to the building's main air circulation system. The shaft was 18 inches square, far too small for a person to crawl through, but it was large enough to pass objects through, and more importantly, it provided access to the vault's interior through a ventilation grate that was secured with nothing more than 4 screws. The designers of the vault had apparently never imagined that someone would attempt to access it from below, through a ventilation system in a mechanical room that required multiple keys to access. Hayes had 3 keys. One opened the mechanical room door. One opened a secondary equipment cage inside the room. The third opened a metal panel that covered the ventilation shaft's access point. He'd made copies of all 3 years earlier, during routine maintenance, when he'd borrowed the originals from the building supervisor's office for just long enough to visit a locksmith in a distant suburb. Working in the dim light of the mechanical room, surrounded by the noise of machinery that would mask any sounds he made, Hayes opened the metal panel covering the ventilation shaft. The shaft extended upward into darkness, a square tunnel of sheet metal that rose 15 feet through concrete and steel to the vault above. Hayes had measured it precisely. He knew its dimensions, its angles, its accessibility. He assembled his tools methodically. A custom-made hook on an extendable pole designed to reach up through the shaft. A battery-powered screwdriver with a specialized attachment. A small, powerful flashlight that he could attach to the pole to illuminate his work. And a canvas bag on a rope, which would be used to lower the money down through the shaft once he gained access to the vault. The most critical moment came first. Hayes extended the pole upward through the shaft, using the hook to catch the ventilation grate on the vault's floor. He'd practiced this motion hundreds of times in his basement, but doing it in the actual shaft, reaching blind into darkness, required intense concentration. The hook caught the grate's frame. Hayes carefully manipulated the pole, positioning the screwdriver's magnetic tip against the first screw. It took 43 minutes to remove all 4 screws. Each one had to be backed out slowly, carefully, with Hayes working entirely by feel and the limited view his flashlight provided. The screws, once removed, were deposited into a small container Hayes had attached to the pole. He couldn't afford to drop anything, couldn't risk any sound that might alert the guard above. With the grate removed, Hayes had a clear opening into the vault's interior, but he still faced the challenge of the vault's door and its time lock mechanism. This was where years of research and planning would prove their value. The time lock was designed to prevent the vault from being opened outside of business hours. It was a mechanical system, supposedly tamper-proof, that would only allow the door's main lock to be opened during programmed time windows. But Hayes had learned that this particular model had a vulnerability. The time lock's mechanism was accessible from inside the vault behind a small service panel. It had been designed this way to allow technicians to perform maintenance without having to wait for the time lock to expire. The assumption had been that no one could access the inside of the vault to reach this service panel. Hayes had proven that assumption wrong. Using an extended tool, working through the ventilation shaft with painstaking care, Hayes managed to remove the service panel inside the vault. Behind it was the time lock's mechanism, a complex arrangement of gears and pins that controlled when the main lock would engage and disengage. Hayes had studied diagrams of this mechanism for years. He understood its logic, its vulnerabilities, its reset procedures. The actual bypass took nearly 2 hours. Hayes worked with absolute concentration, manipulating tiny components through an 18-inch shaft 15 feet away, unable to see his work directly, and relying on his understanding of the mechanism's design. His hands cramped. His neck ached from the awkward angle. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold basement air. But he continued, methodically working through each step of the process he'd rehearsed mentally 1,000 times. At 4:51 a.m., 9 minutes before the alarm system's vulnerable window would close, Hayes heard the sound he'd been working toward, a soft click as the time lock's mechanism released. The vault's main door could now be opened from the inside, despite the time lock's programming. But Hayes wasn't going to open the vault's main door. That would be immediately visible, obviously suspicious, impossible to conceal. Instead, he would take only what he could extract through the ventilation shaft. He'd prepared for this limitation, knowing that he couldn't be greedy, couldn't attempt to take everything. He would take enough to make the effort worthwhile, but not so much that the theft would be immediately obvious to someone glancing into the vault. Using his extended hook and the canvas bag, Hayes began extracting bundled cash from the vault's shelves. He worked by feel, blindly fishing through the opening, pulling bundles down and guiding them through the shaft into the mechanical room below. The money came in wrapped packets, organized by denomination, stored on metal shelving that Hayes had memorized the layout of during years of observation. He took 50s and 100s primarily, knowing these denominations would be less bulk for more value. He avoided coins, bonds, and other items that would be heavier or more difficult to move. He worked quickly now, aware that time was running short, that his window of opportunity was closing, that the guard's next rounds would bring him past the mechanical room's door. At 5:23 a.m., Hayes pulled the last bundle through the shaft. He'd been working for over 3 hours straight, his body aching, his nerves stretched to breaking point. But the theft was only half complete. Now came the equally critical task of covering his tracks. Hayes carefully replaced the ventilation grate inside the vault, using his extended tools to drive the screws back into place. He reset the time lock's mechanism, ensuring it would appear undisturbed to any casual inspection. He closed the service panel, cleaned the area of any metal shavings or debris that might have fallen during his work, and ensured that everything inside the vault appeared exactly as it had before he'd begun. In the mechanical room, Hayes loaded the stolen cash into a large canvas duffel bag that he'd hidden behind the furnace weeks earlier. The bag was heavy, perhaps 60 or 70 pounds of bundled currency, but not so heavy that he couldn't manage it. He sealed the ventilation shaft's access panel, returned his tools to their hiding places, and took 10 minutes to carefully clean the mechanical room, removing any trace of his presence. At 5:47 a.m., Hayes emerged from the mechanical room carrying his cleaning supplies and the canvas duffel bag, which he'd disguised to look like a bag of trash destined for the dumpster outside. He encountered Donald Cruz on the second floor. The guard was making his rounds, checking offices, moving with the tired routine of a man at the end of a long shift. Hayes nodded to him. Cruz nodded back. They exchanged no words. Hayes continued to the building's rear service entrance, where he deposited what appeared to be trash bags into the dumpster in the alley. Except one bag didn't go into the dumpster. One bag was quietly placed behind the dumpster, hidden from casual view, waiting to be retrieved. Hayes finished his shift. He cleaned the upper floors. He completed his checklist. He clocked out at 7:03 a.m., exactly when he always did, and walked home through the cold February morning as snow began to fall. At 9:30 a.m., after a brief stop at his house to collect his car, Hayes drove back to the alley behind the bank building, retrieved the duffel bag from its hiding place behind the dumpster, and returned home. The theft wouldn't be discovered for another 4 hours, when the bank opened for Saturday morning business, and an assistant manager entered the vault for a routine cash count. Even then, the missing money wasn't immediately obvious. The vault appeared undisturbed. The door was properly locked. The alarm system showed no breaches. It took a full audit to reveal that $4.6 million in cash was simply gone, vanished from a supposedly secure vault without any indication of how the theft had occurred. The FBI arrived at the Continental Commerce Bank within hours of the theft being reported. Special Agent Raymond Mitchell, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau's bank robbery division, took charge of the investigation. He'd seen hundreds of bank heists during his career, but this one immediately struck him as different. There was no forced entry, no damaged locks, no bypassed alarms. The security guard reported nothing unusual. The custodial staff reported nothing unusual. The vault's time lock system showed no signs of tampering. For the first 3 days, investigators couldn't even determine how the theft had occurred, let alone who had committed it. They examined every employee, every contractor, every person with access to the building. Terence Hayes was interviewed on February 19, 1979, along with every other custodial staff member. FBI reports from that interview describe Hayes as cooperative, professional, and forthcoming. He'd been at work all night, he explained. He'd seen nothing unusual. He'd heard nothing suspicious. He'd completed his normal duties and gone home. Investigators requested and received permission to search Hayes's home. They found nothing suspicious. A modest house, neatly kept, showing evidence of a man living on a custodian's salary. Hayes provided bank records showing his modest savings account, his mortgage payments, his routine expenses. Everything about Terence Hayes suggested a man with no unusual wealth, no suspicious behavior, no motive beyond the financial struggles common to most working-class Chicagoans in 1979. The breakthrough in understanding the theft's method came 6 days after the robbery, when a team of investigators examining the vault discovered that the ventilation grate could be removed from below. This led them to the mechanical room, where they found faint tool marks on the access panel, evidence that someone with extensive knowledge of the building's layout had exploited a vulnerability no one had considered. The investigation intensified. Every person with access to the mechanical room became a primary suspect. This included Hayes, who was interviewed 2 more times in March 1979. But investigators faced a fundamental problem. Knowing how the theft had been committed didn't prove who had committed it. Multiple people had keys to the mechanical room. The tool marks could have been made at any time. And without physical evidence, witness testimony, or suspicious behavior from any of the suspects, the case began to stall. Hayes, for his part, gave investigators nothing to work with. He continued working at the bank building, showing up for every shift, maintaining his routine with absolute consistency. He expressed sympathy for the bank's loss. He expressed hope that the thieves would be caught. He remained the quiet, reliable custodian he'd always been. Behind this facade, Hayes was living with crushing anxiety. The money sat in his basement, hidden inside a false wall he'd constructed years earlier, sealed in waterproof containers, untouched and untouchable. He'd known from the beginning that he could never spend it, but the reality of living above $4 million in stolen cash while FBI agents questioned him was almost more than he could bear. He lay awake at night, listening for footsteps, imagining raids that never came, convinced that every knock on his door would be agents with a search warrant. But as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the intensity of the investigation gradually diminished. Other crimes demanded attention. Other cases took priority. The Continental Commerce Bank heist remained open, but it became one of thousands of unsolved cases, a mystery without resolution, a perfect crime that frustrated investigators, but eventually faded from active pursuit. Hayes never wavered in his discipline. He never spent a single dollar of the stolen money. He never told anyone what he'd done. He never changed his lifestyle in any noticeable way. He continued working as a custodian, continued living in his modest home, continued raising his daughter on his legitimate salary. Michelle Hayes graduated from high school in 1985. Her father, despite his financial struggles, had somehow managed to help her attend a local community college. She became a teacher, married a postal worker named Jerome Grant, and eventually moved to Atlanta with her husband in 1993. She visited her father regularly, concerned about him living alone, but he insisted he was fine, that he preferred his quiet life in the home he'd shared with her mother. Over the years, Hayes developed health problems. Diabetes, the same disease that had killed his wife, began to affect him in his 60s. He retired from custodial work in 1999 at age 62, collecting a modest pension. His daughter urged him to move to Atlanta, to live closer to her and her growing family, but Hayes refused. He was comfortable in his home, he said. He knew his neighbors. He was part of the community. Why would he leave? The truth, though he could never tell anyone, was that Hayes couldn't leave the house where the money was hidden. He'd constructed his life around guarding that secret, around ensuring that no one ever discovered what lay behind the false wall in his basement. The money had become both his burden and his purpose, a weight he carried alone, unable to share with anyone, unable to escape. In 2012, at age 75, Terence Hayes suffered a severe stroke. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital, partially paralyzed, his speech impaired. Michelle traveled from Atlanta to care for him, working with doctors, arranging home health care, trying to convince her father to finally accept that he needed to leave Chicago and move in with her family. Hayes, even in his diminished state, refused. He recovered enough to return home with assistance from a home health aide who visited 3 times a week. He spent his final years in the house on the south side, moving slowly from room to room with a walker, his world shrinking to the space between his bedroom and his kitchen, the basement stairs now beyond his ability to manage. Terence Hayes died on March 3, 2014, at age 77. The cause was heart failure, complicated by his long battle with diabetes. He died at home, in the bedroom he'd once shared with his wife, taking his secret to the grave. Michelle and her family traveled to Chicago for the funeral. It was a small service, attended by a handful of elderly neighbors who remembered the quiet custodian who'd lived on their block for more than 40 years. After the funeral, Michelle faced the overwhelming task of settling her father's estate. The house needed to be cleaned, belongings sorted, decisions made about what to keep and what to discard. Her husband, Jerome, suggested they renovate the basement, perhaps finish it and increase the home's value before selling. Michelle agreed. The house had been neglected in recent years, and the basement, which she remembered as a dusty, cluttered space from her childhood, could certainly use attention. In May 2014, Jerome Grant began the renovation project. He was a methodical worker, approaching the job room by room, tearing out old paneling, removing deteriorated insulation, exposing the foundation walls to check for water damage. The basement was typical of homes built in the 1950s, with concrete block walls, a low ceiling, and a warren of small rooms originally designed for storage and utilities. On May 17, 2014, while removing paneling from what had been Terence Hayes' workshop area, Jerome discovered that one section of wall sounded hollow when tapped. This wasn't unusual in itself. Many basements had odd construction, spaces behind walls for plumbing or electrical work, but something about this particular wall seemed off. The paneling was newer than the surrounding material, installed differently, attached with screws rather than the nails used everywhere else. Jerome removed the paneling carefully. Behind it was a second wall, constructed from plywood, creating a gap of about 14 inches between the false wall and the actual foundation. The space was sealed, insulated, and clearly deliberately concealed. And inside that space, stacked carefully on wooden shelves, were dozens of waterproof plastic containers. Jerome opened the first container. Inside, wrapped in plastic and preserved almost perfectly, were bundles of cash, $50 bills, banded together, looking as fresh as the day they'd been printed. He opened another container. More cash, this time hundreds. He began pulling containers from the hidden space, stacking them on the basement floor, the magnitude of the discovery slowly dawning on him. By the time he'd emptied the false wall completely, Jerome had extracted 32 containers. His hands were shaking as he called Michelle down to the basement. Together, they stared at the money spread across the concrete floor, unable to fully comprehend what they were seeing. Michelle's first instinct was to call the police. But before she did, she noticed something else in the hidden space. A manila envelope, sealed in plastic like the money, containing papers. She opened it carefully. Inside were newspaper clippings about a bank robbery from 1979, articles about an unsolved heist at the Continental Commerce Bank, FBI wanted posters, and a handwritten letter addressed to her in her father's careful script. The letter was dated January 2012, written just before Hayes's stroke. In it, he confessed everything: the planning, the execution, the years of hiding the money. He explained his motivations: the debt from her mother's medical bills, the desperation, the desire to leave something for Michelle's future. He explained why he'd never spent the money, why he'd lived his entire life above this fortune without touching it. He asked for her forgiveness, said he'd always known the theft was wrong, but had convinced himself he was doing it for the right reasons. He instructed her to turn the money over to authorities, to cooperate fully with any investigation, to not let his crime become her burden. Michelle called the Chicago Police Department that evening. Within hours, FBI agents were at the house, the same office that had investigated the original theft 35 years earlier. Special Agent Patricia Reeves, who'd been reviewing the cold case files just months earlier, now found herself standing in the basement of Terrence Hayes's home, looking at the resolution of one of the Bureau's longest-running unsolved bank robberies. The investigation that followed was both simple and complex. The money was counted and verified: 4.2 million of the original 4.6 million, taken in 1979, with the difference likely due to slight discrepancies in the original reporting. The bill's serial numbers matched records from Continental Commerce Bank. Forensic analysis of the hidden space confirmed it had been constructed shortly after the robbery. Everything in Hayes's letter checked out against the evidence, but the case presented unique legal challenges. The thief was dead. No prosecution was possible. The bank that had been robbed no longer existed, having been absorbed through mergers and acquisitions. The insurance company that had paid the claim in 1979 had also ceased to exist in its original form. Michelle Hayes Grant and her family, who'd unknowingly been living with the stolen money's legacy, were clearly innocent of any crime. After extensive legal proceedings, a federal judge ruled in November 2014 that the recovered money would be returned to the FDIC, the federal entity that had ultimately absorbed the liabilities of the failed Continental Commerce Bank. Michelle Hayes Grant received no compensation, though she was not charged with any crime. The house on the south side was sold, with proceeds going to pay remaining debts and legal fees. The case closed officially on December 15, 2014, exactly 35 years, 9 months, and 29 days after Terrence Hayes walked out of the Continental Commerce Bank building with $4.6 million in a canvas bag disguised as trash. The resolution of the case prompted the FBI to review security protocols and investigative procedures for unsolved bank heists. The Hayes case demonstrated the limitations of traditional investigation methods when dealing with a suspect who exhibited perfect discipline, who never spent stolen money, who never deviated from established patterns of behavior. It showed that some crimes could indeed be perfect, if the criminal was willing to never benefit from their crime, to live an entire life shadowed by guilt and fear, to die without ever enjoying the fruits of their theft. For Michelle Hayes Grant, the discovery transformed her understanding of her father and her childhood. She'd always known him as a devoted parent who worked tirelessly to provide for her, who sacrificed his own comfort for her education and well-being. Now she understood the source of that sacrifice, the burden he'd carried alone for 35 years. In interviews after the case became public, she spoke about the complexity of loving someone who'd committed a serious crime, of reconciling the father she'd known with the criminal he'd been. The house on the south side where Hayes had lived for more than 40 years was eventually purchased by a young couple in 2015. They completed the basement renovation, unaware of its history until a neighbor mentioned the discovery. They briefly considered moving but decided to stay, reasoning that the house itself was innocent of its former owner's crimes. The Continental Commerce Bank building on South LaSalle Street no longer exists. It was demolished in 1998 and replaced with a modern office tower. The only physical reminder of the heist is a small exhibit in the Chicago Police Department's museum, featuring photographs of the investigation, diagrams of Hayes's method, and a single bundle of the recovered cash, preserved behind glass as a testament to patience planning, and a crime that remained perfect only because its perpetrator chose to never reap its rewards. Terrence Hayes spent 35 years guarding a secret that brought him nothing except anxiety and isolation. He lived modestly and died quietly, his crime undiscovered until after death had placed him beyond justice's reach. In the end, the perfect heist proved to be a perfect prison, a fortune that could never be spent, a victory that brought no joy, a a success that meant a lifetime of fear and silence. The money, preserved almost perfectly in its waterproof containers, was eventually destroyed by federal authorities after being catalogued as evidence. $4 million, stolen with extraordinary skill and hidden with remarkable discipline, reduced to ash in a federal incinerator, having served no purpose except to demonstrate that some prizes, even when won, can never truly be claimed. The revelation of Terence Hayes' 35-year secret sent shockwaves through Chicago's law enforcement community and captivated the national media throughout the summer of 2014. The story had everything: a patient criminal mastermind, decades of deception, a deathbed confession, and a fortune hidden in plain sight. But beyond the headlines and the fascination with the mechanics of the crime, the Hayes case raised profound questions about the nature of justice, the psychology of guilt, and the true cost of ill-gotten gains. FBI behavioral analysts studied Hayes' case extensively in the months following the discovery. Dr. Robert Caldwell, a criminal psychologist who consulted on the investigation, noted that Hayes represented an extraordinarily rare criminal profile. Most bank robbers, he explained, committed their crimes impulsively or spent their stolen money quickly, driven by immediate gratification or desperate circumstances. Hayes had done neither. He'd planned meticulously for years, then exhibited inhuman discipline by never touching his prize. The psychological toll of Hayes' decision became clearer as investigators interviewed people who'd known him in his later years. His home health aide, Sharon Williams, recalled that Hayes often seemed burdened by something he couldn't articulate. He would stare at the basement door for long periods, she remembered, even after his stroke had made the stairs impassable. Sometimes he would ask her to check that the basement door was locked, multiple times in a single day, as if he feared something escaping from below. Hayes' neighbors told similar stories. Robert and Dorothy Crawford, who'd lived next door since 1982, described a man who was friendly, but never truly close to anyone, who declined invitations to neighborhood gatherings and seemed most comfortable alone. They'd attributed his reclusiveness to grief over his wife's death, never imagining the real reason for his self-imposed isolation. Michelle Hayes Grant struggled publicly with her father's legacy. In a lengthy interview with the Chicago Tribune in August 2014, she spoke about the cognitive dissonance of mourning a father she'd loved while grappling with the revelation that he'd been a criminal. She described finding his letter, reading his confession, understanding for the first time why he'd always seemed anxious, why he'd refused to leave Chicago, why he'd lived so modestly despite working all those years. What haunted her most, she said, was realizing that her entire childhood had been shaped by stolen money she'd never seen. Her father had told her they couldn't afford luxuries because money was tight, that she'd need to work hard for everything she achieved. All true statements technically, but built on a foundation of deception. He'd given her a strong work ethic and taught her to value honest labor, all while sitting on millions in stolen cash. The hypocrisy was painful, yet she couldn't deny that he'd raised her well, that he'd been a good father in every way except this fundamental dishonesty. The case also affected the original investigators, who'd worked the Continental Commerce Bank heist in 1979. Raymond Mitchell, the FBI agent who'd led the initial investigation, had retired in 1998 and was living in Florida when he learned that the case had been solved. He told reporters that Hayes had been interviewed 3 times during the original investigation and had never given investigators any reason for suspicion. Mitchell remembered him as cooperative, almost invisible in his ordinariness, exactly the kind of witness who gets ruled out early because they seem so thoroughly uninteresting. What frustrated Mitchell most was the realization that the solution had been there all along. Hayes had the access, the knowledge, and the opportunity, but without suspicious behavior, without unexplained wealth, without any of the typical red flags that bank robbers displayed, investigators had moved on to more promising leads. The case file, Mitchell admitted, probably contained the answer to the crime within its first 100 pages. They simply hadn't recognized it. The Continental Commerce Bank heist influenced FBI training protocols for investigating bank robberies. The case became a teaching example of how traditional investigation methods could fail against a sufficiently disciplined suspect. New agents now studied the Hayes case alongside more famous crimes, learning that sometimes the perfect criminal wasn't the one who was never suspected, but the one who was suspected and dismissed because they lived in a way that contradicted every assumption about how criminals behaved. Security consultants also examined the case for its implications about physical security systems. Hayes had exploited a vulnerability that existed at the intersection of architecture and procedure, a weakness that became visible only to someone who understood the building intimately and had unlimited time to study it. Banks across the country reviewed their ventilation systems, their mechanical access points, their assumptions about where threats might originate. The lesson was clear. Security designed by people who didn't think like criminals would always have blind spots. For the residents of Chicago's Chatham neighborhood, the revelation that Terrence Hayes had been living among them as a fugitive from justice, albeit one who'd never fled, sparked uncomfortable conversations about how well people truly knew their neighbors. The quiet custodian who'd seemed so harmlessly ordinary had been harboring a secret that would have sent him to federal prison if discovered. It raised questions about what other secrets might be hidden behind the closed doors of seemingly normal homes, what other double lives might be unfolding. In the midst of ordinary communities, the story of Terrence Hayes and his basement, fortune ultimately became less about the mechanics of a bank robbery and more about the prison that guilt constructs, the way a single decision can define and confine an entire life. Hayes had stolen $4.6 million and gained nothing from it except 35 years of anxiety, isolation, and fear. He'd won his perfect crime and lost his peace of mind, spending decades guarding a secret that brought him no joy, no comfort, no benefit of any kind. In the end, the most striking thing about the Continental Commerce Bank heist wasn't how Hayes had pulled it off, but why he'd bothered at all, given that he'd sentenced himself to a lifetime of imprisonment in everything but name. The money had been his captor, not his prize, and the basement where it sat had been his cell, decorated with the illusion of freedom, but offering none of its substance.